Pearl Buck returned to Lushan in 1922. She had decided to write a book based on her own experiences in China and those of her parents. In his famous LUSHAN declaration, Chiang said, "Once war begins, all people in the north and south of China, and of all ages, have the duty to defend the country." Pearl S. Buck spent 18 years in Guling before returning to the US to study at Randolph-Macon Women's College in Virginia. There, she made no secret of her love for China and the Chinese, to the extent that some Americans considered her odd. This inability to fit in partly explains why she returned to China soon after her graduation. She spent the whole of 1914 staying with her sick mother in Guling. With the approach of winter, most of the foreign occupants of the villas in Guling would depart, leaving their houses to stand lonely and silent in the howling wind. As the weather grew colder, there would be no more cocktail parties, balls, salons, and barbecues. By spending the winter in Lushan with her sick mother, Pearl Buck saw another side of the life of the local Chinese. In Europe, World War I was raging, but all was quiet in Guling. While tending her mother, Pearl Buck also spent a lot of her time reading the Chinese classics. In the course of the next decade, China experienced a string of hardships, from famine and flooding to the battles of the Northern Expedition. But throughout, Pearl Buck was able to remain out of harm's way among the ordinary Chinese. These experiences taught her how the Chinese battled simply to survive. Pearl Buck returned to Lushan in 1922. She had decided to write a book based on her own experiences in China and those of her parents. Thus, in the family villa at Guling, she launched her writing career. In everything she subsequently wrote, she was honest and affectionate towards ordinary Chinese people. The Good Earth, her first and greatest masterpiece, was published in 1931.
《大地》出版呢是1931年，当时美国呢正处在经济萧条时期。这个《大地》中所描绘的中国农民勤劳、诚实，而且呢对美好的生活有着强烈的渴望和追求，这样一种奋斗的精神感染了很多的美国人。这样实际上呢是让美国人以至于让所有的西方人呢了解到了真实的中国人的形象。
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer turned The Good Earth into a successful movie. Like the book, the movie told the story from a foreign perspective, but it also emphasized the dignity of the Chinese and the efforts they were making to improve their lives. This struck a chord with Westerners. Despite the social turmoil in their country, ordinary Chinese people were resilient in working for a better life. Xu Zhimo was a famous poet who lived in a small house in LUSHAN. He would often listen to the loud work songs of the stonemasons echoing through the mountain forests. He exclaimed with excitement, "This is the aspiration of the Chinese nation. It embodies the unquenchable spirit of the Chinese." Xu Zhimo was inspired to write a poem, Song of the LUSHAN Stonemasons. We get up early to find the morning sun rising in the east. Lake Poyang is as low as Mount Lu is high. Go up the mountain and go up the mountain. Lake Poyang is low, but 5 Old Men Peaks is high. Almost at the same time as Xu Zhimo was writing these lines, Pearl Buck was working on her book in her Guling villa. She too heard the work songs, and in them she also perceived the spirit of the Chinese. To her, the work songs depicted the hard-working nature of the Chinese, and also their solidarity. The same year that The Good Earth was published, 1931, Pearl Buck's father, Absalom Seidenstricker, died of illness in LUSHAN. 3 years later, in 1934, she sold the family villa and left China, where she had lived for 40 years. But this did not mean the end of her association with China and the Chinese. Later in life, Pearl Buck continued to write books and support Chinese people. She wanted to show her love for China and her sentimental attachment to her second home.
赛珍珠的传记作家彼得康说的一句话是很能够体现赛珍珠的这个中国情结的。这个彼得康说，赛珍珠对于中国这个他生长于斯的国家的忠诚是永不泯灭的。我理解呢，赛珍珠对于中国的这种忠诚啊，主要就体现在他用一生的时间都在做一件事情。这件事情呢，就是要让西方人能够如实的了解中国，了解中国人。赛珍珠呢，他确实是对中国呢怀有非常深厚的感情。正像他自己说的，我也是中国人。1942年，赛珍珠发表这个汉语演说的时候，他说：“我在这里说话，并不是仅仅站在一个美国人的立场上，我也是一个中国人。我和中国人亲近的，就像和自己的同胞一样。世界上最漂亮的人是中国人，世界上最美丽的景色是中国农村的田野和乡村。”从这些话里，我们都能够深切地感受到赛珍珠那种全的对中国的那种热爱，对中国人民的那种友好情谊。
Pearl Buck returned to LUSHAN in 1922. She had decided to write a book based on her own experiences in China and those of her parents. In his famous LUSHAN Declaration, Jiang said, "Once war begins, all people in the north and south of China, and of all ages, have the duty to defend the country." Pearl S. Buck won the 1938 Nobel Prize for Literature for her novel The Good Earth and her biography of her parents. In her acceptance speech, she said, "I should not be truly myself if I did not, in my own wholly unofficial way, speak also of the people of China, whose life has for so many years been my life also, whose life, indeed, must always be a part of my life. The minds of my own country and of China, my foster country, are alike in many ways, but, above all, alike in our common love of freedom." For many reasons, Pearl S. Buck was unable to return to China again. When she died in 1973, she was dressed in a Chinese-style silk robe. Her gravestone is carved only with her name, Pearl S. Buck. The villa in Guling, where Pearl S. Buck and her family lived, is today the Pearl S. Buck Memorial Hall. Here, visitors can learn about the American writer who made China her homeland and about the history of the villas and the events that took place in them. Rogan's vacation would soon be over, and he was preparing to return home. His family were waiting to hear his stories about his trip to LUSHAN. Perhaps by this time he had some understanding, however small, of why his family were so anxious to hear these stories. Perhaps he was beginning to get a sense of the rural life of the Chinese people and their culture. In the United States, there are many people whose parents or grandparents used to live in Guling and who retain happy memories of the place. They still think of themselves as members of the LUSHAN community. They regularly organize get-togethers, and invariably the topic of conversation turns to life in LUSHAN. On September the 28th, 2007, to mark the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the war against Japan, a monument was erected beside Small Heavenly Pool on Mount Lu. The inscription on the monument, written by 104-year-old General Lu Zhengzhao, reads, "Monument to the War of Resistance against Japanese Aggression on LUSHAN." For most visitors to the mountain, reading this inscription is the first they know about the heroic resistance of the Chinese forces on LUSHAN. The story begins in the early summer of 1937. As usual, a refreshing breeze was blowing over LUSHAN, but it could not dispel the tension and unease in the air. On June the 18th, Feng Yuxiang, Vice Chairman of the National Military Commission, arrived at LUSHAN. 10 days later, Lin Sen, Chairman of the National Government, also arrived. On July the 3rd, Wang Jingwei, chairman of the Central Political Committee of the Kuomintang, joined them, and the following day so too did He Yingqin, chief officer of the Civil and Military Affairs Department, and Gu Zhutong, director of the Xi'an Field Headquarters. On July the 12th, TV Sung, permanent member of the National Economic Committee, arrived at Lushan, followed by the leading society figures Cai Yuanpei and Wu Shi. In fact, in the course of a month, most of the key figures in China had gathered at Lushan, summoned there by Chiang Kai-shek. For Chiang Kai-shek, that summer was filled with crises. In early June, he and Zhou Enlai, the representative of the Chinese Communist Party, had held week-long talks at Guanlu Villa. Chiang was hoping to nullify the influence of the Communist Party's Red Army by establishing a National Revolutionary Alliance. But the Communist Party was aware of Chiang's intention. Meanwhile, the Japanese army had stormed Wanping near Beiping a few days earlier, and had thus shattered Chiang's last hope for peace.
就是这个谈话会，主要是想看看日本的态度。日本挑起卢沟桥事变，蒋介石呢也还没有完全下决心，就是全面抗战，也想看一看日本的下一步动向。他最初的判断就是日本可能是是采取一个局部冲突。实际上呢，他对这个和平呢，对这个和平解决华北事变呢，他还有一线希望。
Pearl Buck returned to Lushan in 1922. She had decided to write a book based on her own experiences in China and those of her parents. In his famous Lushan Declaration, Chiang said, "Once war begins, all people in the north and south of China, and of all ages, have the duty to defend the country." The stance of the Communist Party could not have been more different. They advocated establishing a united front and were actively working to achieve it. On June the 4th, 1937, Zhou Enlai, in his meeting with Chiang Kai-shek at Lushan, had handed him a provisional plan for forming a united front. But Chiang ignored the plan and instead suggested incorporating the communist forces into his own. He even publicly proposed that Mao Zedong and Zhu De should go into exile abroad. So the talks reached deadlock. On July the 7th, 1937, the Japanese garrison at Wanping had launched an attack on the Chinese army. The following day, the Chinese Communist Party published an open letter calling on the entire nation to resist the Japanese aggression. On the same day, Sung Zheyuan, commander of the 29th Corps defending Beiping and Tianjin, was ordered by Chiang Kai-shek not to retreat. Meanwhile, across China, civil and military officials, many of whom had been engaged in infighting for years, launched an unprecedented show of unity. Lushan was swept by a wave of militant passion. The Kuomintang government was openly criticized for its reluctance to act, with people saying that Mount Lu had silently looked on while the heartland was in danger. On July the 13th, the communist representatives Zhou Enlai, Qin Bangxian and Lin Bochu came to Lushan again to attend a forum. They handed Chiang Kai-shek a document called the Declaration of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party on Cooperation with the Kuomintang. Desperate to establish a united front against the Japanese, the communists were offering to make significant concessions to Chiang Kai-shek. The forum was held in the LUSHAN Library, which is today the Memorial Hall of Resistance Against Japanese Aggression. The room has been restored so that it looks as it did back then. On July the 17th, 1937, more than 160 civil and military officials and prominent public figures gathered in this room. Just a few hours earlier, the Japanese government had ordered the dispatch of a further 400,000 men to reinforce its army in China. By doing so, they finally forced Chiang Kai-shek to abandon his policy of achieving internal pacification before resisting the foreign invasion. In his famous LUSHAN Declaration, Chiang said, "Once war begins, all people in the north and south of China, and of all ages, have the duty to defend the country at all costs." In the year 36 BC, a general named Chen Tang, on returning to court after a famous victory, had made the heroic statement, "Whoever invades the Han will be punished, no matter how far he progresses." 1,900 years later, another invasion provoked similar nationwide anger across China. From the mountain that had nurtured poets and given refuge to hermits, a clarion call sounded. The second period of cooperation between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang had begun with the establishment of the United National Front against Japanese aggression.
因为在这之前自从这个1928年吧，济南事变济南事变那就是日军在济南不仅杀害了这个济南人民，而且这个杀害了中国去交涉的外交官，还打死了许多这个北伐军的士兵北伐军官兵蒋介石呢没有抵抗绕过济南继续向北平北伐接着1931年9·18事变又是不抵抗这个1·28抗战，1932年1·28抗战这个是抵抗了，但是呢仍然是局部的再往后这个在这个长城喜峰口抗战还有这个绥远，就现在的内蒙古百灵庙抗战都有这个中国军队和日军的作战，有的还打得很激烈但是呢它都是局部的没有形成一个全面抗战、全国抗战这么一个局面。在蒋介石7月17号讲了那段著名的话他讲了这个话以后，有了这个声明之后全国人民都不分各个阶层吧开始了全面抗战这个所以它这个意义呢是很大的。
July is the hottest and busiest month of the year at LUSHAN. People from all around are drawn to the area. The local hotels and scenic spots are packed. The strange rocks, the springs and waterfalls, the ancient trees and the flowers all charm the visitors. The lush mountain comes to life. "72 years ago, by contrast, July was unusually silent. People on the mountain were engaged in a fight that would see them either survive or die with honor. A year had passed since Chiang Kai-shek had made his declaration on LUSHAN. The advance of the Japanese soldiers shattered the tranquility of the imperial palaces. Beiping and Tianjin had fallen, and the whole of northern China was under threat. On August the 13th, the Battle of Shanghai began, in which 180,000 Chinese soldiers would lose their lives. At the end of 1937, the Japanese took Nanjing, where they embarked on an indiscriminate massacre. The Kuomintang government was forced to move to Wuhan. Mount Lu, towering over the Yangtze River, was a natural barrier to the Japanese army's advance. The mountain was now strongly defended by Kuomintang forces. During the winter of 1938 and the spring of 1939, the Japanese launched attack after attack on LUSHAN. The Chinese soldiers had been fighting for 9 months without reinforcement, but on April the 19th, they were finally forced to retreat